Hello, and thank you for attending Committee of 100's event, Fighting Back Against Hate, Language and the Power of Racist Words. For those of you new to Committee of 100, welcome. And for those returning for another exciting event, welcome back. Xenophobia in the US toward Chinese American and Asian American Pacific Islander community often manifests itself across a myriad of words, phrases, and tropes. The COVID-19 crisis and irresponsible rhetoric by political leaders have fueled a surge of discrimination and hate targeting Asian Americans. But the idea of framing outsiders as threatening is not new. To combat this issue, Committee of 100 has crafted an anti-hate glossary as a guide for identifying terms, phrases, and imagery often associated with the Asian community. After this event, the glossary is available on the Committee of 100 website for public use and will be formally announced tomorrow. Today, Committee of 100 is holding a critical discussion on formulating an inclusive and effective approach for future discourse on the use of language and how it contributes to the damaging stereotypes and exacerbates race-based harassment. Should you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A box. Our team will be fielding those questions, and combined with the questions we receive via email, we will look to get to as many of them as time allows. Our moderator and panelists will each give some opening remarks, and some will showcase some slides to expand on their thoughts. After that, we will have a group discussion and look to take questions as time allows. And now, to begin the program, I have the honor to introduce the Committee of 100 President, Zhang Wong, to welcome our attendees and explain the importance of such a document as the Committee of 100 Anti-Hate Glossary. Z, the floor is yours.
Good evening. On behalf of the Committee of 100, I want to thank you for joining our event tonight, centered around the launch of Committee of 100's Anti-Hate Glossary. I want to sincerely thank our speakers for taking the time to delve into this important discussion, the examination of language, imagery, and stereotypes that have plagued the Chinese American experience since the arrival of the first wave of immigrants to these shores almost 200 years ago. Despite providing a remarkable tapestry of contributions to the fabric of America, from the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 19th century, to life-saving advances in modern medicine in the 20th century, to transformative technology in the 21st century, Chinese Americans still remain subject to the notion that we are perpetual outsiders. At worst, we are seen as foreigners that are a threat, not to be trusted, and to be treated as second-class citizens. At best, we are relegated to the fantasy of a model minority, a group of immigrants who will obey and succeed, though not as individuals, but as a homogeneous faction stripped of our individualities. Feeding into these damaging tropes is the everyday language we use and the representation of images and depictions in media. Language is ever evolving and nuanced. It is not always easy to recognize and avoid the use of harmful expressions. Committee of 100 is glad to share with you this anti-hate glossary, developed as a reference to help understand and identify problematic stereotypes. May this serve as a catalyst for a broader and continuing conversation on the importance of language and proper representation. A healthy discourse invites and recognizes other groups who have likewise had to contend with xenophobic tropes. We are glad to learn from them and learn with them as we work towards a more just and inclusive society. The full released glossary can be viewed and downloaded from Committee of 100's website after today's event. I hope you will enjoy tonight's discussion and continue to support Committee of 100's initiatives, research, and events in the future. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Z. Next, allow me the honor to introduce Committee of 100's Director of Policy, Elizabeth Kerr, who coordinated the research on Committee of 100's Anti-Hate Glossary. Elizabeth will explain briefly the challenges and successes of taking on this project. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Kerr, and I lead government affairs for Committee of 100. I oversee our research, lead our government outreach, and I've spent my career at the intersection of public policy and communications. With the help of many on our staff and the advice of the experts that you will hear from later in today's discussion, I led the drafting of the Anti-Asian Hate Glossary we are releasing in conjunction with today's event. Last year, as anti-Asian hate reached a fever pitch, we knew we wanted to do more to support the Chinese American and broader AAPI communities. And we were really impressed with all the groups providing services to victims of hate crimes. But we aren't lawyers, and we aren't social workers, and we aren't public safety experts. So we looked around for advice. And it's really unfortunate that this expertise has to exist, but we learned a great deal from the Jewish community and their work fighting anti-Semitism. And we really continue to appreciate their guidance and support. In particular, I want to thank the American Jewish Committee for their recommendation that we publish a glossary of anti-Asian hate terms and tropes. Our glossary is modeled after their glossary of anti-Semitic terms. We expect this glossary to serve two purposes. First, we see it as a desk reference for policy professionals and communicators who are new to US-China work. For example, the congressional staffer whose boss just got appointed to the Foreign Affairs Committee, or a foreign service staffer who has been working in Africa issues for a long time and is moving to work on East Asia. There's a delicate balance between sticky communications, colorful language that people remember, and using inappropriate imagery. As you'd expect, this glossary provides examples and definitions of racist and problematic language, but we also categorize the terms and tropes in a way that we hope helps users recognize other problematic language. Language is constantly evolving, and these are not just the terms, but the types of terms that we recommend conscientious communicators try to avoid. Second, this glossary is an opportunity to help the general public better understand the history of Chinese Americans here in America. Chinese Americans have been in America for hundreds of years, and we think it's important to recognize their contributions and also the specific challenges that they face here in America. Language is something we all use every day, so we see that as an accessible frame to share the experiences of Chinese Americans in a way that everyone can understand, appreciate, and most importantly, remember. So I hope you'll find this reference informative and interesting. Thank you for your time tonight and for joining us. And with that, I'm going to hand the conversation over to our moderator and one of the key early reviewers of our glossary, C100 member, Dr. Gordon Chang. Have a good night.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And allow me the honor to introduce our first speaker and moderator for this event, Committee of 100 member, Professor Gordon Chang. Professor Chang is the Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities and Professor in the Department of American History at Stanford University. With degrees from Princeton and Stanford, Professor Chang specializes in the history of US-China relations, Asian American history, and historical connections between race and ethnicity in America. He has written and edited many books and essays on these topics, and several of the books and essays have been translated and published in China and Taiwan. His most recent books have examined the history of Chinese railroad workers in America in the 19th century. At Stanford, he co-directed the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, a project which gave a voice to the Chinese immigrants whose labor on the transcontinental railroad helped to shape the physical and social landscape of the American West. Professor Chang, the floor is yours for some opening comments.
I'm honored and pleased to moderate this very important discussion tonight about hate, speech, and anti-Asian violence. We've seen so much of all this during the past couple of years, unfortunately, and we know that this ugliness is not actually new. It has been with us, both the language and the violence, ever since Chinese began to enter the United States in significant numbers in the mid-19th century. In the decades of the latter 19th century, hundreds of Chinese were brutally murdered throughout the American West. By the end of the 19th century, we know, of course, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and almost every Chinese community was attacked, and most destroyed, burned to the ground, and the Chinese driven out. Chinese resisted, but ultimately had to flee from the violence. But there is something new in our current moment as we've looked back on these past 2 years of this anti-Asian violence. What is new is the national, I think, the national attention that has focused on this viciousness, unlike in past years. And we've seen the close connection between hate speech coming from the highest offices in the land and attacks on the streets of our own communities. And what is also significant is the widespread response against it and the words and the support for Asian American communities. This program is just part of that response. Now, I want to keep my further comments brief because I want to get our distinguished panel on quickly, but here's just an opening thought. I'm sure many of you have heard this saying, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never harm me." When I was growing up, my mother shared that advice with me during tough moments on the playground to help me get through those difficult racist name callings that so many of us experience in schools. She, of course, wanted me to be strong and to rise above the name calling and not have that hate get me down. But we know that sticks and stones and hate words are never really separable. Prejudiced language and assaults on the playground or on the street go hand in hand. Physical acts, even murders, are closely connected to hate speech. Language is not just for communication, but is integral to the formation of ideas, of identities, of characterizations, of social situations and contexts, and even action. So language is essential in human life. And it's important, and it's for this reason that it's critical for us to think about the origin and power of racist words and terms, and what we can collectively do to oppose their threats. Now, with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists who have presentations for us. We now turn to our first panelist.
Thank you, Professor. I'll take it from here. Chang, thank you. Joining Professor Chang on the panel is Professor Karen Umedo, who is the Helen M. Morgan Chu Chair and Director of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. The professor was an advisor on the Committee of 100 Anti-Asian Glossary. She received her master's degree in Asian American Studies from UCLA and her PhD in Urban Studies from MIT. Her research is centered on race relations and issues of democracy and social justice in multicultural societies, with a focus on youth justice and community-driven planning and development in U.S. cities. Her book publications include The Truce, Lessons from the LA Gang War, and Jacked Up and Unjust, Pacific Islander Teens Confront Violent Legacies. She's currently working as an Asian American Studies multimedia textbook so that everyone can learn the histories and experiences of the many and diverse AAPI populations. Professor, the floor is yours for some opening comments and your slides.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Committee of 100, its leadership and staff for organizing today's event, and for my longtime colleague, Gordon Chang, and mentor for inviting me to be on the panel as well. So what I want to do today is show a few slides, and really focus on the pandemic and anti-Asian violence, and give you a simple framework for understanding what's going on today. So I know that a lot of us are familiar with the history of xenophobia and the perpetual foreigner. That dates back to anti-Asian exclusion, racism, anti-Filipino sentiment and activities, especially surrounding the colonization of the Philippines by the US, and anti-Japanese sentiment that surrounded the trade war leading up to the anti-Japanese, the internment of Japanese Americans, including my parents, who were interned for close to 4 years during World War II. So we don't take these things lightly. You know, when my parents were called enemy aliens, when all Japanese Americans were called enemy aliens, that type of language led to the mass incarceration of 125,000 Japanese Americans. And so understanding kind of the dynamics over time, I thought of this kind of metaphor that may help us understand what's happening today. And I call this the perfect firestorm. So we're all familiar with this fire triangle where it takes fuel, heat, and oxygen to start a fire. And I think that this is useful because if we could understand what is it that constitutes the fuel, we could clear the underbrush. If we could understand where the heat is coming from, we could lower the heat. And then if we understand how these shifting winds fuel the spread of anti-Asian hate, we could try to subdue or shift the winds. So let me just take you through each of these very quickly. So if you look at the fuel, there are underlying factors that led to the kind of sudden rise in such heavy violence against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans. So the conspiracy theories and so much information about COVID-19, its origins, the pandemic itself causing so much economic crisis and physical fear. You had growing inequality and these racial hierarchies that were simmering and getting wider over the past several decades. You had the activation of white supremacist organizing, particularly surrounding and following the election of our past president in the Oval Office. We had rising tensions around US-China relations that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And then we had the rise of social media platforms that really allowed hate speech. There was very little crackdown on hate speech. And in fact, unlike other countries, we actually permit that according to the Constitution. And then we still have that persistent image of the perpetual foreigner, a model minority, in the absence of more respectful contact and popular education. And then we had heat, right? When former President Trump termed the word Chinese virus, you had a pronounced jump in anti-Asian sentiment. So these, some scholars, including a colleague of mine at UCLA, looked at over 1.2 million tweets 1 week before and 1 week after the president tweeted the term Chinese virus. And the top line are the numbers of tweets that contained anti-Asian sentiment compared to that contained in tweets that use the hashtag COVID-19. So you could see the dramatic rise, and this is just the first week after the coining of that term. And then you had oxygen that really fueled the spread of anti-Asian hate. And a lot of this took place through social media. And this is just one image of many that really harken back to the imagery of the late 1800s when Chinese Americans faced exclusionary treatment then. This is just one of the more extreme tweets that I found soon after the term Chinese virus was coined. It says from the handle Destroy China, and it says, when you see a Chinese, you know what to do. So these are incendiary types of tweets, both literally and figuratively. So what are the implications for policy and action when we utilize such a framework? I mean, one is really to hold leaders accountable for hate-inducing, scapegoating speech through multiracial campaigns, because it takes everyone to, stop those kinds of things, especially at the ballot box. Reconsider laws to monitor and regulate speech that incites discrimination, hostility, or violence towards a person based on group membership. Integrate Asian American and Pacific Islander studies into K-12 and higher education, and increase positive media programming with AAPIs in more positive lead roles. And I really emphasized the K-12 education because the ways in which the adolescent brain develops and how those connections need to be made at a younger age. And then support community-based best practices for violence prevention, especially against women in public places and in ethnic small businesses where we see a lot of the crimes taking place. And then promote 211 for in-language reporting and victim assistance, or community partnerships for better reporting. And then lastly, address the problem of growing inequality, the erosion of our public safety net, and particularly mental health services. So these are some of the recommendations, and other organizations have offered additional recommendations, but I think this is a good place to start. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Next, we have Dr. Sabo Schmeck, who is the Associate Director at the human rights organization American Jewish Committee in Los Angeles, and a lecturer at the Academy for Jewish Religion in California, where she teaches religious studies and Middle Eastern history courses. The doctor received her BA in religious studies from the University of California, Berkeley, her master's in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School, and her PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Schmeck teaches and writes extensively on world religions, women in religion, and its impact on the Jewish community, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. Dr. Schmeck is the editor of the book Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in America, and the author of the book From the Shahs to Los Angeles, 3 Generations of Iranian Jewish Women Between Religion and Culture. Doctor, the floor is yours for some opening comments and your slides.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here. And on behalf of AJC, we want to thank all of you for being such great allies for us, because we all know we need this allyship. I'm sorry that you have to have your own version of Translate Hate. It's wonderful. You did a wonderful job with it, but I'm sorry that you have to have it just as much as I'm sorry that we have to have it. And what I wanted to do in this brief talk is just talk about what led AJC, American Jewish Committee, to create Translate Hate. So just in general, what is AJC? Because I recognize a lot of people don't know who we are. We are a nonprofit, 501c3, and our mission is to enhance the well-being of the Jewish people in Israel and to advance human rights all over the world. We have 24 offices in the United States, 13 offices all over the world. We work with world leaders, diplomats, members of Congress, and we also work with great community partners such as all of you. What led us in 2019 to create Translate Hate? Why are we here? So hate crimes in the United States rose dramatically since 2016. And what the FBI reported is that while Jews are 2% of America's population, we get 60% of all religious bias hate crimes in America. That's a really, really large number. And I think for the most part, most Jews in America felt like we were safe here and that yes, we experienced anti-Semitism. You still get it a lot abroad, but that Jews were safe in America, and this type of anti-Semitism that we're seeing from abroad doesn't really happen here. And we were absolutely wrong with that, unfortunately. What we really saw was a 200% rise of hate crimes in May 2021. What happened in May 2021 is you had the Israel-Gaza war. And because of that, Jews all over the world were targeted by so-called Palestinian supporters, and they were literally beaten up in the streets of New York. As we see this one man in the hospital, they were Jewish businesses in New York where firecrackers were thrown, where people's faces were burnt, severely burnt. You had people going into the streets of London in Jewish neighborhoods and yelling that Jewish mothers and daughters should be raped. The picture down here. And then the picture that we see to the far left is what just happened literally 5 minutes away from where I live in Los Angeles, where a group of people went up to Jews. And again, this is during the Israel-Gaza war, and asked them if they were Jewish, and then started pouncing on them. And this is at a sushi restaurant, a very popular sushi restaurant. So we knew we needed to create something like Translate Hate. We also saw it in the university, where Jewish and Zionist students, people who believe that Israel has a right to exist, were harassed, were bullied, and were physically harmed. Now, it didn't also make it better that you had academic departments putting one-sided, biased, ahistorical statements that did not look at both sides, but just one side, which further led to the bullying of non-tenured Jewish and Zionist professors and Zionist students. So we recognized that students and people, Jews in America, were feeling incredibly unsafe. On top of that, when, for example, universities were condemning the anti-Semitism, the 200% rise in anti-Semitism that we saw in May, they had to apologize for doing so because they received backlash for it. This is a dear girlfriend of mine, April Powers, a Black Jew. She lost her job at the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. She was the DEI officer because she called out anti-Semitism in May. Thank God they did it for AAPI hate, but when there was no uproar for anyone else, but there was an uproar for Jews. And then, of course, we saw all of this. Jews, Zionists, Israelis, all over the world, basically being targeted, physically harmed online. So we knew we needed to do something. Now, this was 2019 that we first started Translate Hate. By 2020, 2021, we are constantly adding to our Translate Hate document. And we recognize that 21% of the non-Jewish world did not even know what anti-Semitism was, never heard of the term before, and we knew we really needed to educate people. And thus we came out with our Translate Hate. So these are just images some you could see from Translate Hate of what we personally did in order to begin to explain to people what are anti-Semitic tropes and canards, because unfortunately for Jews, we get anti-Semitism on both sides. We get it from the far left and we get it from the far right. And in a lot of ways, they begin to look exactly the same. So we have things such as conspiracy theories where we explain it and then we show pictures of what that means. We also in our Translate Hate discuss, for example, how age-old anti-Semitic canards and tropes are being reinterpreted for today's news cycle on university campuses, et cetera. The concept of deicide, and for example, the idea that Jews were responsible for killing Jesus, and then how that is reinterpreted, especially in the Middle East, where Israelis, which have now become the take Jew out, put Israeli in, are responsible for killing Jesus, etc. The blood libel, Jews were accused in Christian Europe of stealing Christian babies and drinking their blood. And then we see the current day blood libel, whether it is in the Middle East, whether it is in the streets of Los Angeles, whether it's a Belgian trade union boss saying Israelis kill Palestinian children and eat their organs. And this is all recent. This is all 2021, 2020, unfortunately. Again, the poisoning of the wells, we know this just like the Asian community does, where Jews in the past were responsible, they were believed to be responsible in Christian Europe for poisoning the wells. And then, of course, for spreading COVID, or Israel spreading COVID, or having the vaccine of COVID and not giving it and distributing to the rest of the world, this idea of greed. So then we'll juxtapose Jewish bankers and how they were seen as being greedy and all of these canards of Jewish greed, and how that is, again, this is just a couple of months ago on CNN, those tropes are being discussed again and brought up and used as not anti-Semitic tropes and canards that are ridiculous, but as historical fact. We talk about, sorry, let me just move this so I could see it. This just happened in Kentucky, where we had two politicians talking about Jewing down people, why that is anti-Semitic, why you don't use it, this context, and how these words really affect the Jewish community, and most often in a very violent way. Again, the idea of Jewish control, whether we saw it in 1931 in Germany, or whether we saw it with the New York Times edition in 2019. And then, of course, Holocaust denial and distortion. And we follow the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which talks about the Nazi genocide and then the distortion of Jews within that context. We also look at tech companies and how they are responsible for permeating a lot of this type of anti-Semitism. This is a 96-year-old Holocaust survivor who her grandson put out on on TikTok to celebrate her birthday, and this was the response that she got. Then, of course, this also goes into the context of how Israel has become, in a sense, the Jew. And all the anti-Semitic tropes and canards that were placed either right on Jews are now placed on the left in the context of Israel. So being a professor on a college campus, you hear this all the time: from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And we discuss what that means and where that comes from, and how that comes from terrorist organizations like Hamas, et cetera, talking about the desire to annihilate Israel and the desire to annihilate Jews. So I'll be brief. What we also do at AJC with our Translate Hate is that we are now giving anti-Semitic training, DEI training sessions to tech companies, for example, TikTok, et cetera, to universities. We're doing it for businesses, other nonprofits, because we recognize that a lot of people are just ignorant when it comes to Jewish history. And, we believe in counseling and not canceling. And if we could educate you and teach you why these words are so traumatic for us and why it has a history of violence, we believe that this is one step closer to being able to eradicate as much as we can anti-Semitism in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Next, we have Samantha Owens, who is the Regional Director, US at Over Zero, an organization that partners with community leaders, civil society, and researchers to prevent political and identity-based violence. Samantha got her BA in International Studies and Religious Studies from Northwestern University and her MA in Human Rights from the University College London. Samantha is an expert in leveraging strategic communications for social change. Over the last decade, she's led and managed communication campaigns to prevent extremism among youth in Bosnia, prevent youth homeless in the US, and has overseen arts-based initiatives for conflict transformation globally. Samantha, the floor is yours for some opening comments.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Committee of 100 for having me tonight and part of this important program. As Charles just said, at Over Zero, we're focused on the relationship between communication and identity-based violence, understanding how and why communication can fuel the targeting of groups for violence and other forms of harm. To reiterate what Dr. Chang began with, communication is how we understand our place in the world, which groups we're part of, which groups are threatening, what our different identities mean, and which actions we should take based on those meanings. When we're looking at hate speech, when we're looking at dangerous speech, which is a term developed by Susan Benesch and the Dangerous Speech Project, we're really focused on the potential impact. So beyond, of course, the initial harm of encountering the speech itself, but looking at the broader impact. So how do the narratives, tropes, phrases impact what we feel, how we act, and specifically in terms of targeting groups that we perceive as other. I want to start by talking about patterns that we see in messages that target groups for harm. And here I'm drawing on the work of Jonathan Leader-Maynard, who is a political scientist at Oxford University, who has studied identity-based violence across different geographies, across different time periods, and different contexts. With these patterns, there are messages about them and messages about the us. So in these us versus them messages, the messages about them are first that they are somehow all the same in their essence. And something about that essence is different than the us. They are all born dishonest or greedy or dangerous. We often see dehumanizing messages here as well, with comparisons to vermin, disease, or even natural disaster. What this does is it shifts the moral responsibility toward a group, with the implication that if a group isn't really human, is also inherently threatening, like vermin or a natural disaster, you aren't bound to the same moral obligations. You aren't bound to the same rules of right and wrong with dealing with that group. The second pattern that we see is we see messages that paint them as a threat. And that obviously you can see the way that interacts with dehumanizing narratives. And these threats are zero sum. The message here, the core messages within this pattern are that the us group can't exist peacefully, safely, can't thrive as long as they exist. So this fosters a mentality that goes beyond just us and them, or even us versus them, toward it's us or them, which paints then discrimination, harm, physical violence as self-defense. We see, different types of threat narratives spark different emotions, which fuel different types of behavior. So, for example, we see threat narratives around physical security lead to fear, which can fuel attacks on a targeted community. Threat narratives around status, assets, and power lead to anger, which can fuel aggressive, punitive action. And threat narratives around contamination and purity, whether that's disease or conceptions of moral purity, lead to a disgust response, which fuels actions designed to isolate or destroy a targeted group. Finally, the third pattern is around collective guilt, the idea that they are all guilty of a moral transgression or a transgression specifically aimed at the us. And therefore, targeting them for harm is not just excusable, it's actually morally just. It's punishment for a guilty party. I want to touch on just very quickly how these messages interact with narratives about the us group and how we can still be the good guys, the hero of our own story, even while discriminating, while harming, even while committing the worst types of violence. In the types of messages used to support identity-based violence and harm, the us is portrayed as having no other choice, as being brave or even heroic for protecting members of our own group, and willing to do the difficult work to build a better future for ourselves and our children. You can see how these patterns fuel each other and feed each other and strengthen each other. So what does all this mean specific to the anti-AAPI tropes and narratives discussed in the Anti-Hate Glossary? It means that these terms, these different tropes, these narratives all interact to create a really harmful portrayal of AAPI communities and individuals as threatening, as guilty, and as essentially different and even less than human. We see this in the Anti-Hate Glossary. We see dehumanizing terms and metaphors, from dehumanizing terms for Asian women to dehumanizing tropes about being a robotic model minority. We see AAPI folks painted as threatening in myriad ways within the yellow peril trope. And as far as collective guilt, we see false narratives around sexual impropriety, sexual aggression, and even within the model minority myth, there's this sense that somehow AAPI folks have stolen real Americans' jobs or livelihoods. These narratives have been used to make discrimination, harm, or even violence against AAPI folks by real Americans, which has often really been code for white Americans, not just acceptable, but even necessary or heroic. These messages don't happen within a vacuum. They both reflect and fuel real harms against AAPI communities, as Dr. Chang began with. When we look at counteracting the impact of these messages and broader narratives, therefore, we should look beyond just the words themselves and address the underlying dynamics. We really should use the words as part of the overall picture. So we need to think about who's being portrayed as part of the us and what those messages are and how to expand or redefine that. Which speakers are spreading anti-AAP messages and why, and disincentivizing them? What the norms around spreading anti-AAPI hate are and shifting those so that it becomes unacceptable across different groups. And finally, we need to evaluate the different power structures that continue to enable the resonance of these messages.
Thank you, Samantha. Next, we bring back Professor Chang to moderate an insightful panel discussion with all of our featured speakers. Our speakers will use their expertise to formulate a discussion on how to build an inclusive and effective approach for future discourse, on the use of language and how it contributes to damaging stereotypes and exacerbates. Professor Chang, the floor is yours to open the discussion among the full panel.
All right, thank you, panelists. A lot of provocative comments and thoughts and helpful suggestions of how we begin to think about how to combat hate speech and violence. I hope that we can have a good conversation. We get some good comments from the audience and questions. But just to start things off, I'd like to pose this question to you as we think about how to combat hate speech and violence. Is it worthwhile for us to think about the sources of hate speech? You know, where does hate speech and tropes and racist terms come from? Is it helpful for us to think about origins of these things? And if we do we think about what might we focus on? Historical legacies? Do we think about ignorance, if, broadly construed, if people are just unaware or miseducated? Or about systemic inequality, institutional inequality and prejudice. And there are all sort of different ways of getting at this issue of possible sources, or are there others? So I welcome your thoughts about this question.
I'm happy to start with a little bit Asian American, history that will help ground this discussion a little bit. I mean, I think if we look at all of the periods of anti-Asian hate across time, one thing that is clear is that there are kind of economic structures of inequality where Asians were in subservient positions within the labor market. And then those things were reinforced by laws. So you had everything from housing covenants and segregation laws and even labor laws that discriminated against Asian Americans. So you have an economy, right, a stratified economy where Asian laborers historically haven't had the same rights or privileges. Then you had this layer of laws and institutional rules and things that kind of kept that going, right, reproduced those inequalities. And then you had the language, right, that justified and reified that kind of system of inequality. So I think it's important to understand the kind of intertwining of those aspects of history, but also the power of words, right? So you could change inequality, you could change laws, you could change language. And I think sometimes we don't understand the power that we have in shaping the language and reshaping the language. And I think education is one of the ways that we really need to do that. One of the things that I forgot to mention is that the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA, we're launching a big initiative to create an Asian American Studies digital textbook that was mentioned at the beginning. But I think that part of people learning and acquiring the language is for people to begin to understand more deeply the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the US, right? Because ideas and language go hand in hand, and we just don't have that kind of educational infrastructure in the United States. So I'm hoping that that'll change with everybody's working together.
Great, thank you, Karen. Would Sabo or Samantha like to weigh in?
Sure, Samantha, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I would just to give a pretty general answer, just to zoom out a bit. I think it's important. So in terms of everything you listed, history versus ignorance versus different incentives, the answer is yes, we should look at all those things. I think in our work, what we often strive to do is understand what the incentives are for different audiences to spread a hateful message. So it's never one size fits all, right? Different audiences Some may be incentivized to spread hateful and dangerous messaging because there's a direct benefit. Maybe it's an economic benefit. Some may be incentivized to spread hateful and dangerous messages because of felt grievances that they are scapegoating onto another group. Some may be sharing dangerous messages out of a not even from a hateful place, but from in-group empathy and a belief that they are protecting their group. So I think really understanding the nuances of different audiences and why they are sharing hateful and dangerous messages is the first step in counteracting it effectively.
Thank you.
So, there's everything Karen and Samantha said are so true. So I won't add on to that because it's just brilliant. And they really brought up really poignant points. One thing that we really do with AJC, because in terms of anti-Semitism, a lot of it stemmed from Christianity, is we have, the religious aspect of where it comes from too. And so we work very closely with our church brothers and sisters, who, by the way, the Catholic Church, in Nostra Aetate in 1963 apologized for their anti-Semitism, and the Protestant churches then later on apologized for their anti-Semitism, and the liturgy and, everything that they used to promote this idea of Jews deicide and everything else like that. So we really work closely with different religious communities in order to have them, because we can't come in and do it, but we ask that they do it in their theology schools and their seminary schools, etc. So in that way, we could really focus on that. Something that we work closely also with the Asian American community is really countering that model minority myth. Where I think a lot of people look to the Jewish community, to the Asian American community, and they don't see that we are dealing with racism because they think you have it so well, you're doing so well. And so that lack of empathy also leads to a lack of allyship. And we know we all need that allyship in order. We can't do this by ourselves. And that's why it's so meaningful to us at AJC that we're here on this panel, because we need that allyship.
Thank you. I want to encourage our audience to send in comments or questions. But I do have a follow-up question. We've been focusing on sort of, social ignorance, misunderstanding, the domestic interactions. But I want to bring in and this has come up in all your comments, the international dimensions. That this kind of language, this kind of action also has international sources. And I'm wondering now as we go into this fraught time of U.S.-China relations, what thoughts you might have about the implications of intense U.S.-China relations and anti-Asian violence.
Should I go first? I don't, do one of you
want to? The floor is yours, Kerr. Yeah.
Okay.
Take it away.
This has been the source of much anti-Asian violence from, U.S.-China relations back in the 1800s to the Japanese U.S.-Japan relations during World War II, and the trade war with Japan, and the Vincent Chin murder and today. So I think one of the things that is recurring across all of these periods of anti-Asian violence is the fact that there is no distinction made between Asians and Asian Americans. I think that's one of the things. So that, for example, during World War II, my parents, who were Japanese American citizens born in the US, were lumped together with Japanese who were not eligible. Immigrants were not then eligible for citizenship, and they were all viewed as suspect and potential threats to the U.S. To national security. You see the same with the China program here, where so many Chinese scholars and students were targeted, right, as potentially risking intellectual property rights in the U.S. and the trade war with China. And then I think now, I think what happened with the COVID-19 was really a blaming of China and there was a surprising lack of discussion about the origins of zootonic diseases, right? We've had many zootonic diseases that come about when humans develop further into the hinterlands and having more contact with the wild, right? With nature, and these things just happen. They've happened in Africa and Europe and other parts of the world, but that discussion didn't happen, right? There were just these conspiracy theories about how it was maybe invented in a lab, or how, you know, there was a conspiracy to spread it around the world. I mean, just ridiculous notions of malice intent, right, by the Chinese government that really took fire. So I think the conflation, right, of Chinese and Chinese Americans, the demonization of the other country, right, that we're in a trade war or whatever contest with, but you don't see that with Russia. We don't see anti-Russian American hate, even though we really are at war with Russia and have been in the cyber war for years now. So why is it that the trope, you know, always centers around Asian Americans? And I think that's another question that I'll say for another day.
I'm going to jump in and ask another question. Our time is running quick, and we have some questions coming in, if you don't mind. I think there's an interesting point that someone raises here and wants to ask the panelists your belief about the press these days. I guess the press, generally speaking, the media. How do you think about how news sources have reported anti-hate incidents and sentiments, you know, regardless of what the particulars are? Is it as I've used to think about the media, its biases, how it is institutionally structured as commercial enterprises, whatever. What role does the media play in this discussion that we're having?
And it's a huge role, and this was just actually, you know, discussed within the Jewish community, and it was just on air of how little hate. I mean, again, how many people, and I'm sure everyone who is listening to this are very educated, how many people knew within the Jewish context that 60% of the hate crimes, religious-based hate crimes, are against Jews when we're 2% of America's population? They don't really report these things. If I wasn't online and following so many Asian American activists, I probably wouldn't even know about so much of what's going on in the Asian American community. So I don't think the media reports it, and I'm sure every minority community will also say that. But then we also need to, and this is another topic, is the FBI isn't even reporting it adequately because they're not getting the right numbers either. So the numbers that we are giving, or that the media is even sharing, is probably a lot higher because we're not even getting correct numbers coming from the FBI. I'll let others speak.
I have a thought, and yeah, it's so everything that was just said around, you know, the lack of accuracy and reporting as hugely problematic. I will also say that when we're working with journalists and media organizations, one thing that I think is an easy trap to fall into when discussing about hate and hate violence and hate incidents is inadvertently setting a negative norm and also putting extremists or violent actors at the center of the story. So saying things like hate is everywhere, hate is surging, hate is more normal now than ever. You know, while these things may be true, if that becomes the dominant narrative within the media, it can actually further embolden violent actors and feed into violent actors' goals to intimidate and create a chilling effect for participation in civic and public life by groups that have been targeted. And then again, just focusing on hate incidents rather than focusing on the perpetrator, everything they've ever posted, everything they've ever said, keeping the focus instead on the targeted community and community response because that is really who the story should be about. And also highlighting positive norms, right, of allyship and support.
Great. You raised the issue of Samantha about allyship, which I would like to pursue more, but there's some people in the chat who want to know what is the potential for more allyship among all sorts of different communities. But in the last few minutes we have, I want to pose a question to bring it down on another level. I like this, it just came in, and it's very basic. How or what do we do when someone uses problematic language? You know, this is a very basic question. We can talk about the media, we can talk about everyday life, people we encounter wherever. As any closing thoughts, I'll ask each of you to take up this, talk about it intellectually, personally, theoretically, whatever you'd like. And I think that would be a great way to end in a way to think a way forward.
I'll do it in a minute because we have very little time left. You're going to be.
We have a couple we can go over it in a little bit.
Okay. You know, I see myself being that annoying friend that we're having dinner and someone uses an inappropriate term, and then we get into a discussion about why it's inappropriate, and then they blame me for spoiling, you know, the kind of tenor of the good time. But I'm just joking. I mean, there are interesting ways to talk about it. There are funny ways to talk about it. That we don't have to always be put a damper on the party by correcting people. But I think figuring out how to use it as an opportunity, right, to do that education. But I think fundamentally we have to get Asian American materials into the school system to do that education in a much more systemic way.
Great.
Samantha, do you want to go? Do you want me to go?
Oh, I just have two quick things, which is just, again, speaking to the power of norms. I think something that I have used at, say, the Thanksgiving dinner table is just the simple phrase, "Oh, we don't say that anymore," from a norm setting perspective, or "we don't say that." That's not something we say if you share an identity with someone and they see you as a peer. Just, you know, coming at it from that norm setting perspective. And then also a journey story. So, you know, I used to think that was okay to say as well. And then XYZ happened. What you're doing is you're giving someone permission. You're giving someone an easy out to change their mind without challenging the idea that they're the good guy in the story.
Excellent.
You know, and this is why Translate Hate, both of our Translate Hates are so important, because it does get it out in the community. And I said this before, but it's the counsel and not cancel. We're so quick to cancel people. And when we cancel people, we're not explaining to them why this is a hurtful trope. It's something that has a lot of history. I had a student say to me, "Professor Schmeck, I don't understand why the context all about the Benjamins is seen as anti-Semitic. In the community I come from in rural, you know, rural America, that's a compliment for people to think you have money. And you're not going to get yelled at. I'm not going to yell at this poor student. She doesn't, this is her first time taking a Jewish history class." And I explained to her why this is so harmful to the Jewish community. And then she began to understand, instead of, you know, canceling her the way a lot of the students did. And I really commend her for raising her hand and asking that, because it gave her the idea to really understand why this is so painful. We did this, for example, with celebrities on AJC. Nick Cannon said some really horrific anti-Semitic stuff. We reached out to him. He has a huge, I mean, millions of people who follow him, and he retracted that. And he had an open dialogue with us and really talked about that. And I think that's where it becomes so important to have that dialogue.
Great. Thank you all for sharing. I really liked each of those comments, because it leads us to the point here of what each of us can do. I mean, we can help put together glossaries, we can study, we can read books, which we all should, and educate ourselves. And we should step up when things are said which are wrong, hateful, ignorant, that it does sometimes take courage for each one of us to step up and correct the insults or the problem. And that's something that all of us can do, whether, regardless of any type of degree or any type of background. But it's a way forward that each of us can be responsible and I think do something to contribute to a better world. So I'd like to thank all our panelists. I'd like to thank the Committee of 100. I wish we could continue on. We're just beginning this discussion, but I think maybe this is the way we should end, is just the beginning to have this dialogue. Thanks all very much. And thank you all for attending this session with us.
Thank you to all our panelists for their contributions to this very important discussion. 2 brief reminders. Please save the date for Committee of 100's annual gala and conference taking place in Washington, D.C. from May 5th through 7th, where the subject of hate will be part of the agenda of the discussion. Registration for the conference and gala is now open. And secondly, please visit Committee of 100 website to download the glossary or contact Committee of 100 with any questions. Thank you and have a great day.